Hello, hello. I see I have two people here so far, Misha and Prabjot. Can you hear me all right? Got a few more joining. Anyone want to hop in the chat or anything? Just let me know if they can hear me. Or if not, if you see me talking and making a fool of myself by silently speaking. Also message in the chat in case you all really can't hear me. Can everyone hear me? Oh, cool. I see a few yeses, which is good. Awesome. All right. So I'm actually gonna start off a little bit differently from just talking at you. I know usually when people say like we're gonna give a talk of some kind, I think there's generally two camps of people. There's the people who are like, I want to go and I want to interact and I want to be part of it and get some practical experience from this. And there's a group of people who are like, I just want to sit there and have someone wash the answers over me as I bathe in their wisdom. This is probably going to be more the former than the latter, just because the nature of interviews is I can't just stand here and talk and tell you what will work, what won't work. That just interviews are so many different things depending on who's interviewing you, what the role is, what the company is like. So what we're going to try to do is make it a little bit more interactive. So the first thing I'm going to do is post this question to you guys. And I know I've been in enough classes to know like when a teacher says this that it's usually a shot in the dark, but I do encourage you to get off your mic if you're not like in some area that has way too much background noise, just because for one it feels weird to me to just be talking into the void with like literal silence on the other end. Number two, how you communicate is obviously going to be an important part of this. We are talking about interviews. When you interview, you are going to be speaking, and so that's always a good thing to practice. So, with all of that preamble out of the way, the first thing I wanted to ask you guys is the title of this is
okay.
cracking.
Omar, can we wait 2 minutes?
Oh yeah, sure.
I just gotta get one thing through.
Sure. Is it for technical reasons or just are we waiting for something? He abandoned me.
I think he's trying to get it live stream to LinkedIn as well. So he's setting up the streaming service. That's all.
Okay, sure. Let's give it a second. Right,
Sorry for the delay.
No. Just they can all like look at me, embrace, and
I'm sorry. It's just taking a second for it to go to the rest of the streams, and then I will tell you when it's ready. Okay.
Okay.
Be one more minute.
All right. In the meantime, how's everybody's day going? Yeah. How we doing? Thumbs up in the chat if it's going good. Thumbs down if it's going bad. Seriously, it is. Oh, there. I got a thumbs up from Ashton. Everyone else is just dead silent. Freaky. Misha's having a good day.
Because
they're having a good day. I would say I had a pretty midday, but that was mostly because of traffic.
Why?
Traffic was miserable. I had to go downtown to meet in person. For once every month we do this, and yeah, the traffic was just miserable, absolutely miserable.
Actually, my day was okay. We had a potluck at our office.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. I'd say today was okay, but I stayed up late last night till 3. Was cooking for the pot. Miserable.
Oh yeah. And also, this is by the way, people. This is where our tax dollars are going. He's working for the government. It's going to these potlucks.
Okay.
We got him.
We got
him. He's a G-man.
No, but then we have to bring our own food. They're not paying us anything. Really.
That's true. All right. Don't worry. I'm watching you though.
Yes.
All right.
Shower
Connor,
some of that money on me.
that was.
Connor, are we still waiting on it?
Yeah. Are we? Or how are we doing?
It's going through. It says probably another 30 seconds.
Cool.
Okay, perfect. Why did you find the background, Omar?
Why did I pick this background? Well, purple is my favorite color, and it was also the first background that I saw. So, you see
That's
something
the
you
most
like.
NPC.
Yes. Welcome to my my Valley Kingdom, where we literally just conduct interviews. We don't even hire people. We just interview them for our own sick pleasure.
By the way, Omar works for what do you call a startup? So if you want to work with startup, contact him. I'm joking. I'm joking.
I actually have no hiring authority there. But who knows? Maybe we'll be hiring soon. We've been making some moves. I work directly with one of the co-founders on a daily basis, so. But we're not hiring at the moment, so we'll put that aside for now. This is an incredible amount of time for me to fill with just me talking with very little feedback.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go.
All
Go
right.
ahead.
Awesome. All right. So, for those of you who joined us a little bit earlier, I will address that question in a bit, but because we already got a little bit delayed. But for those of you who've kind of been here already, I gave a little bit of a preamble. I hope that you guys will participate. This will be primarily interactive. I'm hoping not to talk even as much as I already have. And that's just because interviews are, many things to many people. It'll depend on the nature of the role, the nature of the company, the nature of your qualifications, things like that. So just me speaking at you about the general nature of interviews probably isn't going to tell you anything you didn't already know. Now, to that end, the title of this talk is Cracking the Code Interview. So there are really two things that this could mean to people, and I'm curious to get everybody's feedback on what they're most interested in. On the one hand, there is the nature of interviews themselves. How do you present yourself? How do you answer some of the common questions that get asked in pretty much any interview? And then there's the code interview stuff specifically, which talks more about the technical side of things. What if you get asked a coding question as an example, or another sort of technical question, and how do you go about addressing that? So just curious, either in chat or through voice, I'd be curious to know what you guys think you'd be interested in starting off with. We will touch on both, but what you kind of feel is the thing that you personally are more concerned about. I'll give that a minute or so. Coding is better. Coding is better in all situations. Okay, coding has the early lead. We've got 3 people all on board with coding. Let's get a few more opinions before I finalize that. Yeah, awesome. We will touch on both for sure. I think people might even just be more comfortable talking about the coding stuff because it's a little bit more technical, straightforward sort of thing to talk about. But we will definitely touch also on general interview stuff, but we'll kind of prioritize based on what we feel people are more interested in. I see Mayank is typing, and then we can continue once he's gotten his input in. Would love things about behavior too. Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right. So I'm going to start us off actually with posing an actual question that I got on an interview, and it's not actually a coding question per se, but I'm going to start there, and we'll get into how to solve it, and then how it relates to some coding questions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the question that was posed to me was, you are a window cleaner, you run your own window cleaning service, and you've been contracted to clean the tallest modern building in Toronto. How much does that cost? What would be your cost estimate for that? And I'd love to get some responses to this. Be warned, I will ask at least one or two people to get on the microphone and justify their answer. So before you provide an answer, I hope you have a strong strong justification. Am I allowed to ask for more information? Because of the spirit of the question, no. I want you to try to put together what you might think is a reasonable answer, and then just be prepared to justify it. All right, so we'll give that a couple of minutes. And then as you kind of come up with an answer, feel free to just throw it in the chat. Or again, speak. I'd love to hear someone's voice. So the question was, you are a window cleaner who is contracted to clean the tallest building in Toronto. How much would you charge for that work?
Can I provide an answer?
You may, of course.
I'm gonna say if it's just a one-time contract, I'll say 10,000. I don't think the
10,000?
CN Tower honestly has that many windows, and I know because of the because they do like those little roof walks. I'm sure there's already a little bit of infrastructure in place for working at heights. Although I know those window cleaners they can charge a lot with all the
Okay.
belaying and stuff. So honestly, I don't know what a window cleaning costs for a tall building, so I'm going to say 10,000. Probably not as high as you'd expect given what the CN Tower is.
All right. All right. Sounds good. Does anybody else have a different answer? You need a number and a justification for that number. You don't have to come up with all the details of the contract, but you should understand generally how you came up with that number. And so I'm gonna modify the question. So Ashton, that was a strong answer right there. And I'm glad you brought up. You specified which building it would be, and justified why you would charge it. So let's now modify the question for people who, so that way they can't steal from your answer. We're now gonna say we're gonna exclude the CN Tower, and we're now gonna say a very tall building. We're talking about skyscraper level, and we're gonna assume it is generally covered in windows. I'm going to make it a little bit harder now that we've already got our first answer. All right, and I'll give us just one more minute. I don't want to spend the entire time on this, but let me know what you guys think. Okay, Prabhat is saying maybe around 50K. Okay, Rodion says he wouldn't, or she. To be fair, I actually don't know the gender pronouns of everybody in the meeting, but they would not come up with an exact number. Chen says $70 an hour or flat fee of 60K. Charge them as we go up, as we don't know the difficulty. 1K starting day. Okay, so these are good starting answers. But I will reveal kind of the secret behind this, which is this problem is one of a class of problems called Fermi problems. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. Feel free to like raise your hand or whatever it is if you have heard of it. And the idea here is to, not the Fermi paradox, that's a separate mathematical concept. Fermi problems are essentially estimation problems. And it says, given very limited information about something, how can I come up with a reasonable estimate? The classic example of this is, how many stars are there in the night sky? All right, but now going to our example, a lot of you gave some small justifications, and that's great. But what interviewers who ask these sorts of questions, and I've been asked this sort of question on like 3 or 4 different interviews, so it does come up. What they're looking for is you actually break down your assumptions, right? A lot of you kind of went with the general, I'm guesstimating what this might be worth based on some ephemeral sense of the amount of work. But what someone might look for in asking this sort of question is, okay, let's break it down. First, we have to set up the belaying equipment and get all of the necessary safety on site. So that could take anywhere between, 3 hours up to maybe 1 day. So let's do the high end, and let's say it'll take us 1 day. Now let's say each individual window will take maybe 5 minutes to clean, right? Windows are not that difficult to clean, particularly from the exterior. So we're going to say it takes about 5 minutes. All right. So how much time is all of this going to take? Well, we're going to need to clean all of the windows, and it's a tall building made entirely of glass. So let's say, since it's a tall building, we're going to say it has roughly 50 floors, right? And on each floor, there's probably, a total of maybe 10 windows on each side, and there would be 4 sides. All right, so we've got, and I'll put this in the chat as well. We've got 5 minutes per window. Here we go, 5 minutes per window times 10 windows per floor times 50 floors, which gets us what? 50 times 50, I want to say 2,500, right? Minutes, which I'm going to approximate is about 4.5 hours, something like that, 4 or 5 hours. Am I being crazy? No, 40 hours. Yeah, it's about a week of work. Typically, they'll let you use a calculator. I'm trying to do this in my head. But yeah, this would be about 1 week of work, right? Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to do this math very quickly in my head. I might be getting off by a power of 10 or something, but this is how you would come up with 2,500 divided by 60 is somewhere in the range of like 440, something like that, roughly. Yeah, I'll call it 42, 41. So that's 41 hours in total. That's about a week of work. And now we can get an hourly rate. Let's say our hourly rate, and keep in mind, we also said it would take about a day to set up the equipment. So we've got a total of 48 hours times, let's say, we charge a rate of $70 an hour. Or let's, for simplicity's sake, let's say $50 an hour, and let's round up our number to 50 hours. So we get a total of 2,500. All right. So how many people To how many people does that seem like a low number? Considerably lower than what they estimated. So a lot of people are saying that this feels too low, but let me ask you, on what basis does it seem too low? Okay, fantastic. So then how would you change the hourly rate? What would you say then is a good hourly rate? And also, generally speaking, you could justify that um, equipment costs, all that stuff is included in the hourly rate. Like you don't necessarily charge a special fee here and then hourly rate there, unless you expected that you generally are cleaning very small houses and you have to add a setup fee because otherwise it's not worth it. But we're talking about the tallest building. Generally, you'll probably spend enough time that it'll be worth it to just eat the cost of setup. So 500 per window, I see. Why? Okay, so this is exactly what I wanted to get, right? Because what they will then typically do is they will start challenging the assumptions. So I wanted to give a deliberately very simplified case of this and see what you guys come up with, right? And this is important because you're going to have to consider these things. And then if someone tells you, oh, but what about this consideration? What about that consideration? Generally, the best response is to either see if it matches, see if you can justify why you didn't include it, or say that's a fantastic point. I need to revise my estimate. Let me do that for you right now, right? So then we could go back. We could take in some of these considerations. We could say, okay, with all of the insurance and everything, maybe I'm a smart contractor and I add a markup for floors that are higher than the fifth floor. And obviously there's 45 of those in our 50-story building, and it's going to increase, et cetera, et cetera. So we can build on this. We can add more to this to make it a little bit more detailed. But fundamentally, what I want to contrast here is initially what we were getting was people were giving an idea of what they thought it should be, right? And the justification tended to be, I think it should be expensive because it seems like an expensive thing to do, right? Now, contrast that with where we ended up, which was we're talking very specifically, okay, here are all the assumptions you made, and I can challenge this one, I can challenge this one, I can revise this one, and I can get a clean number at the end based on what we talked about, based on what those assumptions were and how they changed. And this is the essence of what a Fermi problem asks you to do. It asks you to actually lay out your assumptions, and it asks you to come up with an answer based on those assumptions, right? So this is the first thing that I want to emphasize here. When you're asked any question, whether, and this is for specifically the technical questions, you have to understand what your assumptions are and break down the problem from there, right? And so this is where we can really get into coding problems, where now we're going to take this idea of let me understand what the assumptions are. Let me be very specific about what I need to do, and let me then build from there. All right. So why don't we try a coding problem? And we're not going to try a hard one. And I also won't ask anybody to code anything, obviously, but I will ask you to kind of walk through your thought process. All right. So let's say we have an IDE or a code editor that we're building for ourselves. And now one of the common things in programming is we need to use different sorts of brackets to delimit different things. We have our square brackets for arrays, we have curly braces for code blocks, we have parentheses for arguments to a function, things like that. And one of the main things most code editors will do, unless they're very, very simple, is they will give you some sort of indication of when you've mismatched or failed to properly close your brackets. So how could you implement this? How could you implement a checker such that it ensures that you've always closed your parentheses correctly? Basically, just an imaginary function that returns true if you've successfully closed all your parentheses, or false if you've failed to do so. I won't even necessarily make you worry about the specifics of which parentheses wasn't closed. Just are the parentheses closed properly or not? All right, so Rodion has said number modulo 2. So what is number in this case? I'll also encourage, if anybody's tempted to maybe go and ask ChatGPT or something like that, I would encourage you not to do that. This is really just an exercise for us. And we'll get into some of the issues with using ChatGPT in general. All right, so a lot of people are saying count the number of brackets. So let's say then I had 2 brackets like this. I hope everyone can see that in the chat. If you can't see it in the chat, it's 2 open parentheses, right? That would still be 2 brackets, but that should return false because we haven't properly closed our brackets here. So can we improve upon this? Okay, Ashton has a good point. The last open bracket needs to be closed by the same closing bracket. And for anyone keeping score at home, focus on the first 2 words that Ashton used in his response there. So Ashton, you're on the right track here. Okay, so Mohammed says he'll use if else in a loop to check. Okay, should keep track of pairs. How would you keep track of them though? I think we can use stack. Okay, Prabjot, can you elaborate on using a stack for this? Yeah, so Chen, you're on the right track. Yeah, using nested loops probably wouldn't be the best, more because of the time complexity than because of the space complexity, which is what memory refers to. Um, but you're correct. Using a nested loop, you have O(n) squared at least, depending on how many levels of nesting you have, which it becomes very, very, very complicated very quickly. It becomes very time intensive. Okay, so Rodion, you've revised your counter approach, but what if I did this, where I have two different kinds of brackets, but the same number of openers and closers? All right, so Prabjot, I think you're probably on the closest track here. Put the first, can you just maybe elaborate a little bit on what you mean here? You said, we'll put the first bracket in the stack and put the other, check if they match, then we can pop. So Chen, with recursion, you often run into the same sort of time complexity issues that you might run into with nested loops, depending on how you structure that recursion. So again, from a time complexity standpoint, that might not be the best solution. Yeah. So Prabjot, I think you have the idea. So I'm just gonna restate it and perhaps make it a little bit clearer. So maybe I can do a bit of a screen share, and I'll open up a little whiteboard so everybody can see, because I think this might be a little bit difficult to visualize without something like this. Where are my screen sharing options? And there we go. Oh, why did all of my screens turn off? Did that share successfully? I can't tell yet.
Yeah.
All of my screens started panicking. All right, so what's going to happen is every time you enter a bracket, so we're going to draw a stack here. Every time we draw an open bracket, that's going to trigger us to push it into the stack. Okay, so let's say we have some sequence of, and then let's say we have curly brace on top. All right. Now let's say we get to our first open or our first closing bracket. What's going to happen here? Let's say it's correct. All right. So whenever we get to a closing bracket, regardless of what kind of closing bracket it is, we are immediately going to pop the first thing off of the stack. Now, if you don't know this, remember it. If you do know this, keep it in your memory. Whenever you pop, you return the object that was popped. So now we can see this bracket. All right. And now it's simple. We just compare. Does this bracket pair with this one? And you can do the pairings like a map. You can say this character should return. Excuse my horrible drawing, by the way. should return this character, and then this should return this, etc., etc. And then we can use a very simple if statement. If this in our map matches this, excuse me, if in our map this returns this, and that's equal, we have a correct bracket. And then our stack is updated because now this is gone. And now hopefully we get this next, and then finally we get this. If, however, it's out of order and we get this next, well, we're still going to pop this off the stack. And then what's going to happen? We're going to see there's a mismatch. All right. Now, what happens if we just have an empty bracket? Well, if we have an empty bracket, that's an empty opening bracket as an example, that's going to get pushed onto the stack. Is everybody following so far? I don't want to lose anyone. Feel free to throw in the chat, hey, slow down, or could you go over that again if you need to? But if not, I will barrel forward. So now this is in the stack. Now, eventually, we get to the end of the text. And once we've reached the end of the text, we're then going to say, okay, I'm going to quickly go back and check my stack. If it's not empty, I have an unpaired parenthesis. Similarly, if I just start with a closed bracket, well, my stack is empty. So if I try to compare this with anything, it's going to be compared with null, right? And that will return false. All right. So does that solution make sense to everyone? Just give a thumbs up or whatever you can to indicate to me that you're feeling comfortable with this. If not, we can try to just quickly go over it one more time. Okay, cool. Rodion says makes sense. Okay, so now I want to go back through this and talk about how it relates to what we've said about how to solve problems in general. All right, so way at the start of this, Ashton had mentioned we need the last open bracket to be closed by the same closing bracket. And I said to focus on those first two words, last opened, which if you're familiar with what type of data structure a stack is, it's last in. So you see, we actually have a good pairing here. The last open bracket, last in, right? And we also happen to know the first thing that should come out is the first thing that should be ended is the last thing that was opened. So first out. As soon as you have a problem where you say, okay, first thing that goes in has to be the last thing that goes in has to be the first thing to be checked, immediately there's a stack for you. All right. Now, how does this relate? Because again, we need to focus on how do I turn what seems like an abstract problem into something concrete, right? So we have to start by talking about it and trying to kind of nudge it towards terms that we know. All right. So again, going back to what Ashton said, he said the last opened bracket. All right. So there's the first hint. If I'm looking at the last thing, last in, those are terms I know. Last thing that I was focused on means last in. All right. Now it needs to be the first thing that I checked, first out. Last in, first out equals stack. So in this way, we're kind of practicing how do we problem solve. And the reason I actually proposed this not as a coding challenge where I would ask you guys to quite literally write out code that you think would work for this, but just as a thought experiment, and why we also talked about that Fermi problem earlier, is because all coding fundamentally starts from there. All coding starts from, can I break the problem down first into issues that I understand before I proceed with actually writing anything down, actually writing any code. And this is generally how you're going to want to code even professionally whenever you're faced with a problem. So I wanted to practice that. I want you guys to then go and practice that, because it will be kind of the fundamental skill both in your coding interviews when you get technical challenges, and in your actual job as software developers or whatever have you. All right. And another thing to emphasize, and why I asked initially, can we justify this, is a lot of times, even if you don't have the same answer that the interviewer is expecting, your ability to justify your answer will be very important. So again, going back to my own experience, quite literally this job that I'm working in now, um, they had a different answer than what I provided. Now, mind you, my answer was still correct, and it still worked to the same level of efficiency as the official answer, but it kind of initially had them going, "What are you talking about? This doesn't really match with what we've established as the approach for this." But because I had kind of sat through this problem and, really justified, why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Why am I doing this? I was able to then communicate that to them and do it in a way that they understood why I chose the particular approach that I did. On top of that, it means I don't necessarily have to be 100% right to convince the interviewers that I'm competent enough to do the job. Um, so these are kind of the key takeaways I want you guys to take. Number one, practice your problem solving. More than doing lead code or whatever, do like random puzzles. Anything that you find interesting, do problem solving. Number two, when you're doing it, write down your justification. Really try to break down why you're doing something. And if it doesn't make sense to you, stop doing it. Don't proceed with things that don't make sense. If you do those two things, you'll immediately have a huge leg up on solving problems in technical interviews. Now, I'm trying to get to a kind of a nice conclusion with that, because I would like to now kind of pivot towards some of the behavioral interviews, because we've only got about 15-20 minutes left here. So to that end, is anybody, maybe besides Ashton, who's been answering, is anybody brave enough to get on their mic and answer the question, tell me about yourself? No one? Chen, I see you have your hand raised. All right. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like. I guess I have to allow it. All right. Your mic has been enabled.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So you said to introduce myself, right? Tell me about yourself.
How would you answer? Yeah, how would you answer the almost universal interview question? Tell me about yourself.
Okay. Well, my name is Chin. I am a first-year student at Sheridan College, studying software development, network engineering. I'm currently doing full stack development with a small game company, using React.js as our main framework and Nest.js as our backend framework. I've had a few projects that I did to basically start off my career, which are like basic games using C# through Unity, and smaller text-based games using Python. And I'm honored to be here today.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So I think you did a good job there. You focused on what matters to the interviewer. What are the technical skills that you have? How you've gained them, the projects that you've worked on. I think that's a very strong start. Now, what I will say is that is a good start, but at the end of the day, this is kind of your opportunity to first grab the interviewer's attention and get them to really think about you. So again, to kind of piggyback off my own experience, when I was interviewing for this company, and obviously tell me about yourself, and keep in mind, these guys are all based in U of T, so some of the people that I'm interviewing against are U of T Waterloo students who, maybe have the educational credential advantage over me. So selling myself at this point was very important. And so the company I work for, Stable, focuses on particular aspects of patient care. And so when they asked me, tell me about yourself, obviously I did the rundown of, this is what I'm studying. This is why I, like my alignment with the role and with the company. And then I kind of emphasized, but look, I have a past in biochemistry. Now, why did I leave that behind? Because the work that I was doing, it wasn't really engaging to me. But there was a reason I got into it. And the reason I got into it was because I wanted to do something to help patients. I wanted to do something to help people who needed care. And I think this is a fantastic opportunity for me to kind of merge this thing, the software engineering thing that I love, with that ideal that I've always been chasing, and I haven't really been able to get a foothold in it. And I think finally I can do that here, right? And obviously that's true, and you should not lie in your interviews to the maximum extent possible. But what I tried to do there was not just say, I am technically checking all of your boxes. I'm trying to say, I am technically checking all of your boxes, plus I have something that no one else has. Or I have something that distinguishes me from other candidates who might also have the same technical skills. So this is kind of the core of it, right? And I'll talk about a couple more questions in the sort of vein. But exactly, who you are as a person, it still has to be relevant to the role, right? It still ultimately has to be, here is the value I bring to you, right? That is ultimately what an interview is. It's just your personal sales pitch as to why you're better than all of the competitors for this particular role. But yes, you ultimately have to bring some sort of personality, some sort of compelling reason why, of all the people who match the qualifications, and there will always be many of them, why are you the one who deserves this role? And it's generally the people who can do that effectively who often end up, not just getting roles, but maybe roles they couldn't have otherwise gotten, roles that maybe someone else, even with slightly more qualifications, might have gotten, but you simply had a more compelling pitch, right? It's all kind of a sales thing. And so with that in mind, when you answer an interview question, your goal is to not necessarily just answer the question. Your goal is to answer the spirit of the question. So to give you an idea, I might say, tell me about a time, and again, if anybody is feeling brave and willing to, open up their mic, just raise your hand. I'll allow mic, and you can take a shot at this. But you might get asked, tell me about a time where you were stressed out. And honestly, I'll leave it at that. Tell me about a time that you were stressed out, and how you managed it, things like that. Does anybody want to give that a shot? Anyone? Be very good for you if you did. I can promise you that. So if you do want to, raise your hand or mention it in the chat. No, I can promise you it'll be worth your while. I don't I don't hurt anyone as far as anyone can prove, at least. So Chen, yeah, you can go. I want to give someone else a chance. I want to, but they don't want the chance. And again, you're free to, and you're also free to answer in the chat, but I do encourage you to try to answer with your voice, because how you speak, how you say the words that you're typing are also important. Now I know, again, some of you might not be super comfortable even speaking in English. But again, on an interview, you will be face to face or camera to camera with your interviewer. Unfortunately, you won't have the opportunity to just type all of your answers. So getting the practice now where, there's really nothing at stake, I think is going to be beneficial for anybody who's willing to take that shot. But again, feel free to put your answers in the chat for demonstrative purposes. I can always comment on those. But again, I'd love to hear some voices. Bizan, how would you answer this question? Oh, Sim Yuan He. I'm either mispronouncing that or you might have a nickname or something, but sure, let me unmute you so you can give this a shot. All right, you should be able, you just need to unmute yourself and you should be able to go for it. My icon hasn't changed. It looks like it's enabled on my. Can you try clicking on it? It should be now. You should be able to toggle it so that your mic turns on. All right, go for it. Yeah. So yes, you will need to actually click on it to unmute yourself if that's the problem.
Who's having the audio issue? I failed to send a prompt to allow them to talk.
Sure. I thought I'd already done that. It's Sim Yuan He.
Yes,
Is there any?
he has
Okay.
access. They have access to present, or sorry, to speak.
Yeah, it might just be a separate technical issue. Maybe their camera, or sorry, their microphone isn't actually connected. Is there anyone else? Ashton, you are free to answer this question now. I have heard one other voice at least, so if you'd like to come up, or anybody else, obviously.
Sure. Sorry,
All right.
I didn't hear the question. I was helping
Oh.
Connor troubleshoot the stream. What was the question?
So the question was, tell me about a time where you've been stressed and how you handled that.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay, so I used to work in sales for a tech company, and it was pretty stressful towards the end of the month when you're trying to hit your quota of sales, like hit your sales target. But so I would get pretty stressed out, but I always had to keep in mind that if you don't get, like, the way they would talk about it is, if you don't get more kicks at the can, you're not going to get any more sales, right? So if you let the stress kind of get to you and you know, you don't work as hard, or you take some time off or whatever, that's not going to be conducive to hitting that goal. So really for me, it was just taking it one step at a time, one call at a time, making sure that I could do like the smallest task possible, even if that was just picking up the phone and dialing. And yeah, you just go from there. Like, break it down into small tasks, because it can seem kind of overwhelming when you have like a few days left, and you got to hit, like, I don't know what number, like 5 sales or like whatever you would normally hit in like more days than that, right? But just breaking it down into something small something small and manageable, and something that you can at least put the effort in and do that. So that's kind of how I've handled stress in a job before.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, I like that answer. So to kind of emphasize, I think some of the key points there, you kind of set up the situation well. You said, okay, well, we're getting towards the end of the month. There's quotas to hit, whatever have you. Obviously, that results in stress, and you kind of, I would say, I like the answer. You kind of skirt around having been actually stressed out about it, but that still, still implies like this was stressful for you. Um, and I think the part that I really like is you really broke down exactly what you did to combat this, right? take the big overwhelming problem and kind of just say, okay, well, I just need to take it one step at a time, make sure that I continue, in a kind of good pace without overstressing myself, without overwhelming myself. And through that, I was able to manage it. I'm going to nitpick and say there's always the opportunity to be a little bit more explicit about like the outcome side of it. I know a lot of people will say, we'll talk about this STAR method, which is like situation, task, action, result. So describe the situation, describe what you needed to do, describe what you ultimately did, and describe how it was a positive outcome. So just that R part of it can be a little bit more meaty. And then one other thing, which I kind of deliberately did, which is a lot of times interviewers will just stay quiet to get you to kind of talk yourself in circles. Now, Ashton did a good job of, putting a kind of final pause there by saying, so that's how I handled the stress on the job. And generally, even if it requires you to take a pause, which again, Ashton did, he kind of reflected on his answer before he answered. It's better to take that pause and give a well thought out answer than to start rambling and eventually potentially kind of dig yourself into a little bit of a hole. So when you're talking about these behavioral questions, what we've already said here is consider this a sales pitch. You need to not only just check off the criteria that they've put on their job description, you need to sell yourself in a way that distinguishes you from other people who might be equally or even perhaps more qualified. Number two, take pause for your answers. You don't necessarily have to answer every question right away. And in fact, it's probably a detriment if you do, because as I mentioned, a lot of times you'll get a question that is not intended to just ask that question, right? It's not intended to just say, tell me about how stressful your job is. It's about get into the details of how you manage that. Get into why are you more capable than someone else of being able to handle a high pace, high stress job. Number three, craft your answers in a way that you show you're addressing the question, you are getting results out of that, right? Those are kind of, STAR can be abbreviated into those two. You're actually addressing the real question that's being asked, and you are showing that you can answer that question in a way that presents you in a positive light, right? Two things. Answer the actual question, demonstrate a positive outcome from that question. All right. Now we could continue this sort of practice interview stuff. I know the timing and the pace of this sort of thing tends not to be as conducive. It's one of those things you generally like to have a lot of time to do. But I would like to kind of open the floor to some questions. If there's anything specific you guys would like to know about, feel free again to just pop that in the chat, talk, whatever you got.
So I have a question about kind of the general structure of the interview. So
Sure.
Obviously to get the interview, you got to have like a good resume or a good LinkedIn, good projects, good cover letter, GitHub, so on. Once you get into the interview, they're going to ask, like we did, kind of like behavioral questions, logical questions, maybe like an actual coding challenge. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of like the main overview of what the actual process will be like, or is there anything I'm missing, some other area that you really need to prep for?
So different companies have different processes, obviously, but there's a couple of main ones. Typically smaller companies, that's what you'll get. You'll get one interview where they will ask some number of behavioral questions, possibly some logical and some technical questions as well. And you'll usually do that with 1 to 2 people. As companies grow or just decide for some arbitrary reason that they want to make candidates jump through hoops, the interview process can get more layered. So a very common structure is you have a first level interview, which is not really an interview. It's typically done on the phone, and it's about 10 to 15 minutes. And it'll just be an HR representative who will ask some sort of administrative questions. Are you still interested in this position? When would you be available to start? What are your salary expectations? Are you eligible for this? Do you have all of the qualifications that you claim you have? This generally doesn't need much preparation just because it really is just administrative. Most of the questions are very simple and straightforward to answer. But one thing that some companies like to do is kind of get you on the salary end of it right up front. They like to kind of surprise you with that because, you weren't expecting this phone call. No one scheduled this with you. Someone just called you up and started asking you these questions. So you've had very little time to prepare. So I would generally recommend look up if salary is like, and I know for a lot of students at this stage, they're kind of salary is a bit secondary to getting my foot in the door. But don't undersell yourself. I mean, if you have good skills, you have good skills regardless. So I would say always research from that end just to give yourself the best possible starting point if the salary negotiation element starts to creep up earlier than you might expect. Now, typically then the next layer is kind of a informal interview. So you'll typically meet with, possibly the person who's you're actually going to be directly reporting to, or, maybe a senior member of that team who will do some general assessment. And this is where you'll start to get some of those behavioral questions. And that will typically go like a standard interview, right? Where you might have some technical questions, some behavioral questions. A lot of them will be stuff that you've seen before. And then the third level, which at this point I personally think it's a little bit gratuitous, but a number of companies will like to do this, where you'll then go on to kind of higher level or people who your role affects, even if you don't necessarily report to them. And knowing what their role is, asking that question if you know that there's going to be a third round and you know that might be an opportunity to there might be an opportunity to learn about these people, knowing what their role is will give you a huge advantage in speaking with them, because if you know that in advance, if you can prepare for it, you now know exactly what your value to that person might be, right? And this is a fantastic thing to ask in that first level interview. When you're meeting with the direct team, you can say, what other functions do I typically interact with, and how could I best work with those teams? Because now, when you're the junior developer, but they're telling you, you're going to be interacting with the marketing team to help them work with design. If you happen to know, well, a marketing team representative is going to be on that third stage interview, or you happen to ask that question and you find out about it, or about the interview process. There you go. You now have the advantage of, let me ask directly, what sort of things might I be doing with that team? So when I get to that level of the interview, I can say, hey, marketing team, here's what value I can bring to you, right? I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, the interview is just a sales pitch, right? It's nothing more than that. It is your personal sales pitch for why you are better than your competitors for this particular role. And the more knowledge you have, the better your sales pitch is going to be. So that end, I tend to actually not recommend too much like trying to figure out the company in advance, because a lot of companies keep any sort of meaningful information not public, right? They will typically have like their public facing about me, and you should know that. You should know what the company does and have kind of a sense of what you might be doing in the role, but focusing all of your time on that, personally, I would say is a bit of a waste of time. Most companies will care more about what you're like in general than if you know like every detail of every person who's ever worked at this company. So when you're talking about preparation, when you're talking about what kind of interview structures you might face, know enough about the company to be able to talk about it and not seem like you quite literally just sent in an application and have no idea who you're going to be speaking with. But if you do have the multi-stage interview, be prepared for it. It can be a little bit of a grueling process. It can be a bit of a discouraging process because, and I can tell you this, I interviewed for a company. I quite literally did 4 interviews. First 3 went fantastic. The people I was going to report to like me. The people they report to like me. But one lady in sales said I didn't have enough experience in one particular aspect and decided that was it. Which obviously for me was frustrating. I gave them my resume. They knew what experience I had and didn't have. But this is ultimately the thing. And ultimately, as you kind of go through these interviews, it can be tough, especially with these multi-stage interviews. You just have to kind of be prepared for like, there are 100 reasons why a company might reject you and 1 or 2 why they will take you. So even just the mental preparation for that is another thing. I know I've kind of drifted off of the topic a little bit as I'm kind of picking up other elements that this touches. But to kind of get back to the core, those are kind of the main things. If you're looking at a smaller company, typically it'll be a very straightforward process. It'll be one, maybe the HR and then the main interview. Other companies might have more elaborate processes. A lot of tech companies will ask you to do a code screening first. They'll send you a coding challenge, ask you to do it, and then they'll pick the best out of those to proceed. And then that again might be a multi-stage process. And so the best I can say is, if you have the opportunity, ask leading questions for the next stage of the interview in whatever stage of the interview you're in. I think that's really the best advice I can give you for preparing for those multi-stage ones. All right, yeah, that was a fairly in-depth answer, so I'll cut myself off there.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
No worries. No worries. Any other questions? I know we're kind of running over time, but we also had some technical issues at the beginning, so. And Connor, if you got to like end this because I'm like wasting the GDSE's money or anything, feel free to tell me.
I have a question about at the end of the interview, they usually ask you if you have any questions for them. Um, are we obligated to ask them a question? Because I imagine at that stage, the interview was probably ended, so whatever you're asking, it doesn't really matter, I guess. But I want to know what you think.
Conventional wisdom, and I would agree with conventional wisdom in this case, says you should ask some questions. The reason being, it can come off as if you basically just didn't really care if you have no questions, right? Like even for me, right? At the end of this whole talk, I said, "Are there any questions?" And I waited, and I personally felt it would be weird if no one had any questions. It would almost seem like no one was really paying attention, because there has to be something that I didn't cover. There has to be something that someone wants clarified. And it's the same in the interview. A lot of times these can take quite a bit of time. And you will get to the end of it and it'll been like a 1-hour conversation. Like, so do you have any questions for us? And you go, no, I'm good. I'm happy to just call it there, which can be, a little bit surprising. It also sometimes can kind of betray a little bit of a lack of preparation. So in that case, I would say, if you really are not great at, like if you're one of those people who, and it happens to everyone, who tends to be very nervous and maybe isn't able to necessarily recall questions or come up with questions on the spot, at least have 2 or 3 go-to questions that you can ask at the end, just to show you care and you want to be part of this company. So one of my go-tos is often, all right, we've talked about this, and I tend to tailor it as well depending on the context. Especially if they've noted something in particular that's like, oh, you don't really have as much experience in this. I will kind of turn it back and say, what, given what you've said about I maybe have less experience in this or that, what would you recommend I do to mitigate that, help correct that in the time between now and when I would potentially start, right? That immediately says to the interviewer, okay, this guy isn't just here to kind of show up and be like, hey, please hire me, I want money. He's willing to put in some effort and try and fix these gaps to whatever degree he can in the time, even before he's gotten a job offer or started the work, right? So having good questions, even if you can't think of them on the spot, it's better if you can think of at least one or two on the spot, just because it shows again that you kind of paid attention. But I know interviews are stressful, and preparation always helps with the stress. So if you have some back pocket questions like that, it does help to show the interviewer that you care and that you want their feedback and you want to hear what they have to say. And like I was mentioning to Ashton, if you are in a multi-stage interview and you know that this is going to be a multi-stage interview, it is best to try to ask some questions about what the next steps are, who you might be speaking with, and what your interaction might be with those roles if you were to get the opportunity that you've applied for. So I would recommend strongly ask some questions, prepare some questions if you're not able to come up with them on the spot. And yeah.
Thank you so much for all the information. That's a lot to take in.
Yeah. Interviewing, like anything, is a skill, and it is practice. It gets easier. And this is why I was saying, this is why I kind of touched on the mental health component of it. I know, so this is kind of my second career. But when I first graduated from university in biochemistry, I applied to some like 700 jobs in the period of like 4 or 5 months. Probably like 20 or so interviews at least, which is still not a great conversion rate. It's still like under 5, something under like, yeah, under 5%, under 3%. Dear God. Anyway, not important. And then at the end, it was one job that I got. It can be a slog, especially when you're new, especially when it's kind of your first time getting into the professional field. But if you can kind of stomach that, if you can find the ways to not get discouraged by that, it is actually very beneficial. It teaches you a lot about what you do well in an interview, what you need to work on in an interview, gives you the opportunity to work on those things. So practice, apply. If you don't get it, like I said, there's 100 reasons you won't get a job and 1 or 2 that you might. So you have to be prepared for the rejection, and you have to take the lessons from it as much as you can. And yeah, so that I think would be, an important aspect of it. Just be prepared for the rejection, because it'll be good practice. Yeah, you have follow up, Chen?
Oh no, I was trying to hit the react button, but I hit raise by accident.
All right, awesome. So last thing I will say, I know I've gone quite a bit over. I am departmentally mandated to tell you that LinkedIn is the best. No, so online presence is one thing that I do want to touch on, though, is it is easy to find people online these days. And it really depends. All of it depends. Companies are very different in their hiring processes. But, this is one of those, like, it's better safe than sorry. Try to keep as clean an online profile as you can. You know, don't go spouting off at the mouth about this or that company is terrible if you didn't manage to get an interview with them or didn't manage to pass the interview with them. um, Everybody recommends LinkedIn. I guess technically I have to recommend it as well, but I'm weirded out by the idea that, like, Microsoft gets to know everything about everyone because you have to have this for your career. I don't personally like that idea, but it is something that some people will check. Again, personally, I haven't seen an interviewer ever once ask me about whether my LinkedIn was like up to date and polished or like 2 3 years out of date. I've never really been challenged on that. But I know that this is something that can sometimes come up, right? And especially if you're at the beginning of your career, you always want to give yourself the best possible odds. You know, keep your LinkedIn as up to date as you can until, if you really don't like LinkedIn, like I do, try to just get to a point in your career where you don't need it anymore. But until then, it is a bit of a necessary evil, or a handy tool if you really like it. So yeah, keep that up to date. There's plenty of online tools that will help you with polishing that. If you're not comfortable with your English, put the bullet points and slap that into ChatGPT and let it write it for you. But try to keep that up to date, at least insofar as you're in the beginning, like few years of your career. Once your experience and technical skills can speak for themselves, feel free to get rid of it. I haven't seen anyone who's like said on either end of it, this very well qualified candidate had no LinkedIn and therefore they were disqualified. So yeah, I guess that concludes all of the things I wanted and was asked to say. So if there are no more questions, are there any more questions? I'm just going to open it up one last time. I'm going to count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, no more questions. So with that, I thank everybody for showing up today. It was nice not to have to totally speak into an empty void. So I appreciate that. And I hope you learned something. I hope you got something out of this, and good luck to all of you. Obviously, I hope you all have fantastic careers going forward. All right, so that'll be it for me. I will sign off. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you, Omar. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.